So again, a very warm welcome to the second part of the inaugural event of the newly founded research training group on 4 meaningless matches at the University of Göttingen. It's a great honor to introduce today's lecturer, Noam Chomsky, who is a laureate professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona and Institute Professor Emeritus at MIT. And he will talk about minimalism, where we are now and where we can hope to go. Being the founding father of modern linguistics, Noam Chomsky has developed grammar theory since the 50s of the previous century, and this more recently has led to the introduction of the minimalist program, the topic of tonight's lecture. This program aims to trace all central properties of human language and linguistic variation back to a single small grammatical derivational system and its mapping to other cognitive systems. But as you're all here to listen to what Noam has to say about minimalism and not me, I will directly give the floor to him. Noam, thank you very much for providing this lecture. We're thrilled. Noam Chomsky, Minimalism, where we are now and where we can hope to go.
Thank you. There isn't time to work through detailed arguments and results in the areas of current work that I'd like to discuss. There is a good deal available in manuscripts that are in press or circulated in case you'd like to look further. I think it may be more valuable to focus on how the work finds its place in the broad and ancient inquiry into language and mind, and what it suggests about the future, what it suggests about what kinds of questions are within reach and what remain hopeless mysteries, in some cases, as they've been for millennia. My own feeling is that we're entering into a new era in the inquiry into these classical concerns. For the first time, it's becoming possible to provide genuine explanations, term I'll clarify later, genuine explanations for fundamental properties of language, explanations that yield surprising, far-reaching conclusions about language and mental life more generally. I'll try to give at least the flavor of these conclusions. I should perhaps start by saying that the term minimalism is a little bit misleading. Minimalism is just ordinary science. That's all. It's a program in ordinary science. Well, a good place to begin is at the beginning. 2,500 years ago, it's about as far back as detailed records go. That's when the Delphic oracle issued a maxim defining our primary task, know thyself. Well, a two-word aphorism can be interpreted in many ways. Given what we know today, a reasonable way to interpret the oracle is in collective terms, as advice to try to understand what kind of creatures we humans are. Humans appeared very recently, some 200 to 300,000 years ago. That's a blink of an eye in evolutionary time. And not surprisingly, there's very little diversity among humans. The slight differences are what matter for life, the commonalities we take for granted. For understanding ourselves, the proper stance is the exact opposite. What is deeply important, most revealing, is what is common to us, distinguishing humans so radically from all other life on Earth. Variation exists, but it's superficial. The same is true for internal systems, say the visual system. For life, what's important is a correction of glasses or a cataract operation. For understanding ourselves, what's important is, for example, the remarkable fact that a few presentations of several dots is reflexively interpreted as a rigid figure in motion. That's what's important about the visual system. Same for language. So if I were physically with you now, what would matter to me is my difficulties in handling German. For understanding ourselves, what matters is the deep properties of the common faculty of language that makes it possible for an infant to acquire any language, virtually reflexively, with equal facility. These are among the major lessons of the 17th century scientific revolution, which created modern science. The most salient lessons are the importance of being puzzled about what seems to be obvious, such as the fact that a heavy ball falls faster than a light one, except that it doesn't, as Galileo showed with ingenious thought experiments. Another lesson is the importance of studying simple cases, like falling objects, abstracted from the phenomenal world where basic principles are obscured by the wealth of interacting factors. These are good lessons to keep in mind. There are compelling reasons to interpret the advice of the oracle collectively. What kind of creatures are we? What are these species' properties that are common to humans, apart from severe pathology, and are without significant analog elsewhere in the living world, even among our closest relatives, the higher apes? That is, the properties that paleoanthropologists call the human capacity. When we inquire into this question, I think we find two striking properties that satisfy this austere criterion: language and thought, at least thought in any way we can grasp and can study. Well, when inquiry reveals two distinct properties that virtually define the species, the next question is, obviously, what relation holds between them? The simplest answer would be the relation of identity. Language is a system for generating thought. Thought is what is generated by language. That is, in fact, the answer that was given at about the same time as the pronouncement of the oracle in classical India by a famous Sanskrit scholar, Bhartrhari, one of the founders of the great tradition of Indian grammar and philosophy. In his conception, reported by Wolfram Hinsen, language is not the vehicle of meaning or the conveyor of thought. Rather, language is the generative principle of thought. Thought anchors language, language anchors thought. Using language is thinking, and thought vibrates through language. Similar ideas resonate through intellectual history. The 16th century Spanish physician, philosopher Juan Huarte set the stage for the first cognitive revolution that followed shortly after by emphasizing what he called the generative quality of human understanding, unique to humans, the capacity that we constantly exercise in using language in normal life to construct new thoughts, to interpret those of others. Huarte also identified a still higher form of intelligence that enables some to create work of true intellectual and aesthetic value, while the rest of us, lacking this talent, are at least able to enjoy and appreciate it, sometimes to carry it forward. It's another species property that presumably derives from the language thought complex. Huarte also insisted upon the universality of language structure, on the brain as the material site for cognitive functions, and on the innateness of these functions, along with the generative quality of human understanding. These ideas have been revived without any awareness of the long forgotten history. They have been revived in the what's called the cognitive revolution of the 1950s. It's a very sharp break from then prevailing structuralist behaviorist doctrines. Well, these ideas actually flourished during the 17th century scientific revolution, which laid the basis for modern science. Language did not escape attention. Galileo and his contemporaries expressed their awe and wonder about a truly remarkable fact. With a few symbols, each of us can construct infinitely many thoughts in our minds, and we can convey to others the innermost workings of our minds. For Descartes, the normal creative use of language, employing this capacity, was a foundation for his postulating a second substance, res cogitans, relating language and thought, a substance unique to humans. In his metaphysics, Galileo himself regarded the alphabet as the most spectacular of human inventions because it captured this marvel. Galileo's amazement was echoed centuries later by Gottlob Frege, founder of modern logic, logical philosophy. Quote Frege, he found astonishing what language accomplishes. With a few syllables, it expresses a countless number of thoughts, and even for a thought grasped for the first time by a human, it provides a clothing in which it can be recognized by another to whom it is entirely new. Well, the amazement of these great thinkers is entirely warranted, as is their insistence on puzzlement over what seems self-evident. This insight poses what we may call the Galilean challenge. How is this achievement possible? The challenge seems to me to capture lucidly the major issues, tasks faced by inquiry into the nature of language and thought, in fact, into the unique nature of the human species. We have made some progress in this task. A lot remains mysterious. The Galilean challenge initiated the rich tradition of general and rational grammar, as it was called. General, because it sought universal principles underlying human languages. Rational, because it sought to go beyond description to explanation. Throughout, language was generally regarded as closely bound to thought. The common understanding was captured simply in William Dwight Whitney's phrase that language is audible thought. We now recognize that sound does not have that unique status, as you can see. The great humanist Wilhelm von Humboldt went further. He literally identified language with thought. He too characterized language as a generative activity, Erzeugung, his terminology, not some fixed object. And he pondered the fact that somehow this activity makes infinite use of finite means. It's a basic element of the Galilean challenge, commonly quoted now, but usually misunderstood. Crucially, he said, it's infinite use of finite means. That's crucial. Humboldt's formulation of the Galilean challenge brings to light a serious gap in the tradition. It failed to accommodate Aristotle's crucial distinction between possession of knowledge and use of knowledge, contemporary terms between competence and performance. The tradition kept to use of knowledge, more specifically, use of knowledge in production of speech. Little was said about perception of language, prime concern of modern psycholinguistics. Both production and perception are use of language that access the knowledge that is internally possessed. Well, appropriate means we're not available to formulate clearly and to investigate the fundamental task, to unearth the system of knowledge possessed, the internal language, I language in technical usage. This gap was overcome by the modern theory of computation created by Alan Turing, other 20th century mathematicians, and adopted in the modern reshaping of the tradition around mid-20th century. These tools made it possible to resurrect Aristotle's long forgotten distinction between possession and use of knowledge, and to launch serious study of possession of knowledge. They also made it clear how a finite mechanism can have infinite output. That does not resolve Humboldt's puzzle about production, but it makes it possible to carve out the domain of feasible inquiry, the study of generation of the knowledge possessed with finite means and infinite scope. Production of language, like other creative action, is beyond reach of inquiry in any fundamental sense. That is true even of simple voluntary action. certainly use of language. The distinction between generation and production of language is fundamental, commonly misunderstood. Generation lays out the terrain. It says, here are the linguistically formulated thoughts. Production is an activity that makes use of these thoughts, very commonly in innovative and creative ways that are not understood. The crucial step in production is the mental act of selection of the thought to be expressed from the infinite store of generated expressions. How this is done remains a complete mystery. Once the thought is extricated from the store of expressions, what remains is a virtually mechanical input-output problem, the kind we know how to deal with. When you look at the literature on production of language, you're looking at that secondary phenomenon, the input-output operation. In Cartesian terms, the use of our language is appropriate to circumstances, not caused by them. We're incited, inclined to speak in certain ways, but not compelled. That's Humboldt's infinite use, completely not understood. And Huarte's higher form of creativity is still more mysterious. Well, these new tools of the theory of computation made it possible for the first time to develop explanatory theories of language that yield an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions that constitute thoughts and that can be externalized in some sensory motor medium, usually not necessarily sound. We can call that the basic property of language, the generation of an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions that constitute thought can be externalized. Well, as soon as this enterprise was undertaken in mid-20th century, problems quickly arose. The reigning structuralist behaviorist consensus had no real puzzles. Everything essential was known. Procedures of analysis could be applied to any corpus of materials. But as soon as the search for explanation began, it turned out that almost nothing was known. Virtually every sentence poses new puzzles. Furthermore, the elements that were postulated in the best theories could not possibly be found by a schedule of procedures, just as in every other branch of science. There is a certain resemblance to the 17th century. Well, explanation in the language case has to proceed at two levels. At one level, a generative grammar of a language is a theory that seeks to explain its properties, the knowledge possessed by the language user. At a deeper level, the theory of the shared language faculty is concerned with the innate factors that make language acquisition possible, factors that distinguish humans from other organisms. Modern terms, that's called universal grammar, UG. It's adapting a traditional term to a new framework. Again, something that's often misunderstood. Well, UG has goals that appear contradictory. It must meet at least three conditions. First condition, UG must be rich enough to overcome the problem called poverty of stimulus, the fact that what is acquired demonstrably lies far beyond the evidence available. Second condition, UG must be simple enough to have evolved under the conditions of human evolution. Third, UG must be the same for all possible languages, given the fact that there's no biological adaptation to specific languages. Well, we achieve a genuine explanation of some linguistic phenomenon only if it keeps to mechanisms that satisfy the joint conditions of learnability, evolvability, and universality, which appear to be at odds. The course of theoretical inquiry has been driven by the goal of reconciling these conflicting requirements. These problems were evident at the outside of the generative enterprise. We now know that they're considerably more severe than what was then envisioned. With regard to evolvability, genetic studies have shown that humans began to separate not long after they appeared. There are no known differences in language faculty, which must already have been in place. That leaves a very narrow window for emergence of language. There is no meaningful evidence of symbolic behavior prior to emergence of Homo sapiens. These facts suggest that language emerged pretty much along with modern humans. And if so, we would expect the basic structure of language, UG, to be quite simple, the result of some relatively small rewiring of the brain that took place once and has not changed in the brief period since. The apparent contradiction with learnability, therefore, becomes much larger. Well, research on language acquisition has extended the dilemma further. It's been shown that a child of 2 or 3 has largely mastered basic properties of its language, including some quite remarkable ones. Furthermore, statistical study of the data actually available to a child shows that the relevant evidence is very sparse. These discoveries seem to require that UG be very rich in order to overcome the enormous gap between data available and knowledge attained, while the evolvability condition demands the opposite, that UG be very restricted. And the problem of endless variation lurks in the background. Well, in the past few years, for the first time, some hope has emerged to resolve this tangle of dilemmas. It's within the so-called minimalist program. So we can now see how, by looking at fundamental and quite puzzling universal properties of language structure, these issues might be resolved. Most important one is the fundamental property of language called structure dependence. Just to illustrate with the simplest possible case, just consider the properties of elementary coordination. So, for example, the sentence, "The boy and the book are in the room." Notice, not "is in the room," or "in the room." Well, compare that with "the boy with the book is in the room." In this case, is, not are. These properties are known to infants as early as it's possible to experiment, before 2 years of age, down to 17 months in some experiments. And that raises puzzles. To determine agreement, the child does not use the simplest computational rule, adjacency, and instead, the child reflexively relies on something it never hears, the structure that its mind creates. And the child then assigns singular or plural by virtue of the nature of this abstract structure. Well, inability to use simple properties like adjacency can cause considerable difficulty as sentences become more complex. You can try it and see for yourselves. What is used automatically is highly non-trivial computations, far more complex than adjacency, which is reflexively ignored. Well, let's take it a step further. Consider the sentence, the mechanic who fixed the car carefully packed his tools. It's ambiguous. Could have fixed the car carefully, could have carefully packed his tools. Now put the adverb carefully in the front. Carefully, the mechanic who fixed the car packed his tools. Now it's unambiguous. It means that he carefully packed his tools. The adverb carefully seeks a verb, but it cannot use the simplest computation. Pick the linearly closest verb. UG forces us to ignore the simple computation and to select the more remote verb, which happens to be the structurally closest verb, as we see when we assign the structure in what our mind tells us is the correct way. Well, it goes without saying that none of this can possibly be learned. There's supporting neurolinguistic evidence. Experimental work on the brain shows that if subjects are presented with invented languages modeled on actual languages, the language areas of the brain react normally. But if the invented languages use very simple rules involving linear order, there's diffuse activity in the brain, indicating that the person is treating it as a puzzle. It's not activating the language areas. So we therefore have a major puzzle. The infant ignores 100% of what it hears, linear order, and it attends only to what it never hears, and its mind constructs. Furthermore, this is true of all constructions in all languages. Well, there's only one possible answer, namely, linear order is simply not available to the child who's acquiring a system that constructs thoughts. Well, why does speech require linearization? Reasons obvious. The articulatory system cannot produce structures, so the externalization process must impose linear order on an internal system of generation of thought, which is unordered. As you can see, sign language is less strictly linear because there are wider options available in visual space. The sensory motor systems used for externalization have nothing at all to do with language. They were in place long before language emerged. They have not changed since. True language is the internal system that generates thought, the I language, internal to an individual, coded as a recursive generative procedure in the brain. Well, we now face a serious question. Why does the infant reflexively ignore 100% of what it hears? Linear order. Why does the infant attend only to what it never hears? Abstract structures constructed by the mind. That question wasn't even asked until recently, but now we have an answer fairly straightforward answer. If you think back to the basic property, it requires a computational procedure. The simplest computational procedure is binary set formation, merge in current work. It's very easy to show that if recursive generation is based on merge, then structure dependence is imposed and there is no linear order. You just add a note here, some serious qualifications, which I'll return to later. There are many consequences. One is that certain thoughts become inexpressible in speech, even very simple ones. So just shift from conjunction to disjunction. Take the sentences, either John or Mary is in the room. Either the girls or the boys are in the room. How about either the girls or John is or are in the room? Neither is possible. The thought is very clear, and if number agreement were based on adjacency, could be very easily expressed. But with structure dependence, the thought is inexpressible in a straightforward way, necessary to use some paraphrase. This is one of many examples of conflict between optimal design and utility for communication. There are many others that are far more serious than this one. They're always resolved in the same way. Communicative efficiency is always sacrificed. To put it metaphorically, when Mother Nature was constructing language, she was concerned with optimal design, not with how the system might be used. If it turns out to be dysfunctional, so be it. It's worth noting that that's how evolution works quite generally. We can distinguish 3 steps in evolutionary change. First step is innovative. Some disruption takes place, maybe a mutation. Or to take a real example, a bacterium accidentally swallows some microorganism, yielding eukaryotic cells. It's the basis for complex life, sheer accident. The disruption introduces something new. Then comes the second step, reconstruction. Nature redesigns the new system in the simplest way, satisfying natural law. These are matters discussed in depth in classic work of Darcy Thompson on laws of growth, Alan Turing on creation of patterns by physical law. That's the second stage. Third stage is winnowing. Natural selection reduces the variety to the better adapted. The simplest solution produced at the second stage might turn out to be dysfunctional, but nature doesn't care. In reconstruction, nature seeks optimal design, following physical law. It has no way to consider possible functions. Well, language seems to fit the normal pattern. So we can envision an evolutionary scenario that looks something like this. Some small rewiring of the brain yielded the general property of recursive generation. Nature then took the usual course, seeking the simplest such operation, relying on natural law, in this case, principles of computational efficiency. The result is a system based on merge, satisfying the basic property. The deepest and most surprising property of language, structure dependence, follows at once with its ramified consequences. UG encodes the outcome The infant, therefore, reflexively ignores everything it hears and attends only to the abstract structure the mind creates, fleshed out as thoughts. Well, in these terms, we can envision a resolution of the conundrum facing UG. The diversity condition, the third, can be put to the side in the study of the core system of generation of thought. The variety of languages might be localized in basically externalization and peripheral aspects of the lexicon. Perhaps completely, we might learn. Research seems to me to be tending in that direction. That would be a very natural outcome. The poverty of stimulus conditions on the core system are severe, sometimes clearly insurmountable, as in the case of structure dependence. Furthermore, the amalgam of sensory motor systems and language poses a cognitive problem that can be solved in many ways. It would not be surprising to find that it is the locus of the apparent complexity, mutability, variety of language, all superficial if these ideas are on the right track. So at least for I language, the conundrum is largely reduced to solving the evolvability condition. And that problem will be overcome to the extent that the structures of I language are generated by the simplest operations. The so-called strong minimalist thesis, SMT, sets this outcome as a prime goal of the theory of language. Very recent, but it turns out very fruitful idea. Well, these observations reinforce the traditional view that language is essentially a system of thought. The modern doctrine that language is basically a system of communication that may have evolved from animal communication seems totally untenable. Well, returning to the evolutionary scenario, the winnowing stage may never have been reached, probably because the system is so tightly integrated that it's either all or none. And that's increasingly what we find when we investigate more complex cases. This account of structure dependence is the first case of genuine explanation in the study of language, in this case, dealing with a fundamental and surprising property of language. There are others. One, in fact, is the basic property itself, product of merge-based computation. Another is the ubiquity of displacement, always with reconstruction. That had always been regarded as a curious imperfection of language, problematic departure from good design, something that has to be explained in some other terms. So in early days, phrase structure grammar was considered somehow natural, transformations problematic. And we can now see that the opposite is the case. Displacement is what we expect. In fact, displacement with reconstruction. That's what's yielded by the optimal and most economical subcase of merge, internal merge. That's the case that involves least search by a huge margin. The real question is why language ever resorts to the far more cumbersome subcase, external merge. That's clearly a reflection of the fact that language assigns argument structure to generated expressions that requires externally merged generated structures. There are other illustrations of this. One very interesting one is the module of control, both subject control, object control. They have quite intriguing properties, including crucial distinctions between null elements, which are traditionally called trace and pro. Those are illegitimate notions that have to be eliminated. Turns out that all of these properties follow directly from the strong minimalist thesis. In other terms, they're enabled by the strong minimalist thesis. Control model would have no reason to exist if language were not designed in accordance with SMT. There are other cases would take time to spell them out. I don't know how much time I have.
Yeah, some more 10 minutes,
How much?
10 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, let me see how much I can fit in. Well, I may skip this. I'll try to discuss briefly. Language, of course, is a computational system, means it has primitive elements, computational procedures to form new elements. In our case, the primitive elements constitute the lexicon of atoms of computation for I language. The lexicon is the set of, it's called formatives, minimum, meaning bearing, lexical and functional elements. And of central significance are the elementary lexical items that relate language to the external world, the terms that are used to refer or to denote. Note, used to refer, not refer. That's an important difference. Referring is an action, a speech act. Many factors enter into it. Reference is a relation between a symbol and an extra mental entity. There happens to be good reason to suppose that language has no reference relation. We can see this from very simple examples. So take the phrase, he's pushing an open door. It's commonly used in a metaphoric sense. There's no opposition to what he's saying, so he's pushing an open door. But it also has a literal sense. Let's keep to that. Well, what's being pushed is a material object, but an open door is an abstraction. The world doesn't contain objects that are simultaneously concrete and abstract, like doors. In fact, even the material part raises difficulty. Not easy to spell out what is required for something to be a door. Or take the parasitic gap construction. Which book did you burn without reading? Something both concrete, which you burned, and abstract can be read. Actually, the same holds for virtually every word. In Aristotle's terms, these items are an amalgam of matter and form. So the matter of a house is its bricks and wood. The form of the house is its characteristic use, the design, the intention of the architect, other factors that can't be detected in the physical object. These actually become quite intricate when we look closely. In fact, even the most elementary referential terms turn out to have very complex meanings. Well, since the lexical atoms don't refer, language has no semantics, at least semantics in the sense of Frege, Tarski, Carnap, Quine, model theoretic, truth functional work, and formal semantics. All of that is technically part of syntax, manipulation of internal symbols. The relation of language to the world is more indirect through actions using language. It's contrary to what's commonly assumed. Well, studies of language acquisition, particularly those of the late Lilac Lightman, have shown that items are acquired on very few presentations, meaning that they're based on rich, innate substructure. Learning is apparently a matter of settling relatively superficial properties. Like most of language, the basic facts are known with virtually no evidence, no analogs to such concepts in animal symbolic systems, no record of their development. Well, for these reasons, the origin of human concepts has always seemed a hopeless mystery, buried deep in the prehistory of Homo sapiens. That's the way it's always seemed to me. But on reflection, that's highly unlikely. The rich and intricate concepts that are the atoms of the lexicon would have had no function outside of a system of generation of thought that yields complex expressions that can enter into reasoning, reflection, other mental acts. If they had emerged before language, they would have disappeared as useless waste. So it's very plausible to suppose that these concepts developed after language was available. How? It might be, we can only guess, but it might be possible to explore the question if it falls within the history of humans, which may be possible in the future. Serious anthropological work now reaches back tens of thousands of years. It's a very challenging area of investigation. The enabling function of SMT might play a role, virtually unexplored, very much worth thinking about. Well, I'll finish up by talking about problems with merge. So to achieve genuine explanations adhering to SMT, we have to rely on the simplest combinatorial operation, the one that nature would provide in the second stage of evolution, reconstruction in the simplest way after some disruption has taken place. Well, the concept used in recent work is merge, binary set formation, and I've been keeping to it so far, but that turns out to be incorrect. Turns out that merge has flaws of a familiar kind. It does too much. That is a familiar problem. Shows up all the time, unrecognized, very significant. There are several ways in which a explanatory theory can fail. The familiar way is inadequacy. Doesn't reach such and such facts about language, maybe parasitic gaps, so it has to be extended or modified. There's a much more important form of failure. The theory does too much. It works just as well for non-language, say for simple rules involving linear order. That kind of failure is very hard to remedy. The most prominent current example of that is deep learning. It's now eliciting a great deal of excitement. No doubt it's useful for various purposes, but it is not an approach to language or any other organic system. The reason is very simple. It works as well or better for systems that violate fundamental principles of language or biology generally. So it's not part of science. It's part of engineering, maybe useful engineering. And that seems irremediable. And the same holds quite broadly. Well, as we've seen, any approach to a theory of language must explain why infants ignore 100% of what they hear, linear order, and attend to what they never hear, structures that their mind creates. And any theory that fails this test is disqualified in a very deep way. It does far too much and is therefore not a candidate as a theory of language. There's only one approach I know that passes this exacting test, namely one that excludes linear order, other surface arrangements, from I language, that is, from the pure linguistic thought generating system, keeps to an operation that forms only structures. Well, optimally, something like merge. Allowing too much is a familiar problem. Goes from structural linguistics up to merge-based theories. So take the procedures of structural linguistics. They could work just as well for about any collection of data. That was actually recognized, but considered a positive feature. It's called sometimes the Boasian principle, that languages can differ in every possible way, and each one has to be studied on its own. Actually, that's a position that's still pretty widely held. In earlier times, it was held for organisms too. Not long ago, it was assumed that organisms could vary in any possible way. Recently, that's been shown to be entirely wrong. There's deep conservation of genetic systems. There's laws of form, very few options. Study of languages proceeded on the same course. By now, good reason to suppose that the range of possible I languages is sharply limited. Wouldn't be a great surprise if it's discovered that there's only one. Well, this issue of too much power has risen repeatedly in the course of generative grammar. So take, say, phrase structure grammar. In phrase structure grammar, there's nothing to stop a rule like NP yields VPP. There are also hidden assumptions. What's the relation between NP and N? Just two different symbols. Well, for these reasons, in the 1960s, phrase structure grammar was abandoned, was replaced by X-bar theory. Solves these problems, raises new ones. The ones that it raises are exocentric constructions, things like subject-predicate. Usual way that's described now is NP, TP, where the TP is TVP. Standard assumption is it's a TP. It's illegitimate. Just as well call it an NP, neither. Same with other NP, XP, YP constructions. Happens to include all cases of internal merge. That takes us on to current work on labeling, which I can't go into now. Meanwhile, transformational grammar was sharply refined. Howard Lasnik, Moore, Saito reduced it to move alpha, move anything anywhere. Then internal merge, finally recognized to be just a case of merge, actually the simplest case. At this point, we're now in the 1990s, it became possible to ask and to begin to answer many why questions and to approach genuine explanation. Well, so far, so good, but not good enough. Merge has the same flaws as phrase structure grammar and transformational grammar and earlier proposals. It's too powerful. It allows impossible languages. It even allows legitimate derivations of ungrammatical expressions. And it has hidden assumptions that have to be smoked out. Well, these turn out to be very interesting problems. I think they're largely solved in current work that there's no time to review. With this in place, we really can provide genuine explanations for the first time over an interesting range. And following these paths, we may hope to get real insight into the nature of language and thought, fundamental features of the human capacity, possibly entering into a new era of these studies with exciting prospects, I think. Stop here.
Thank you very much, Noam. And this was a great talk. Thanks a lot. And now the floor is open for discussion. So the Q&A will start now. If anybody has a question, please type it in the chat. Ideally, yeah, I see already one question by Paul Stott. Do you maybe want to read out your question, Paul?
Is this on the chat?
This is on the chat. Paul, let me read it out. Maybe that's easier because of the technology. Paul Stott says, there seems to have been a breakdown in communication between theoretical linguistics and psycholinguists since around the 90s. This means that major influential theoretical contributions end up going untested experimentally. What advice do you have for bridging this gap? What do we need to do better?
For some reason,
it's on the chat.
Figure out how to go up on the chat. Oh, okay, now I'm on the top. Let's see if
it's the question asked at 9:33. Paul Stott.
Get this thing to go down. Oh, okay. I see something that says, consider again example one.
It's one above.
One above it. Okay. Oh, there seems to be a breakdown in communication between theoretical linguists and psycholinguistics since the 90s, improving. This means that major and influential theoretical contributions end up going untested experimentally. What advice do you have for bridging this gap? What do we need to do better? Well, I don't think it's entirely true. There's very good work in psycholinguistics, processing, acquisition, and so on. So for example, I mentioned Lila Gleitman's work on acquisition, most important work. On processing, a lot of work by my colleague, Tom Bever, many others. There is a gap, and the gap has to be overcome by psycholinguistics looking at the facts of language. If psycholinguistics is studying things that aren't language, of course there'll be a gap. Now this goes way back. The earliest efforts in psycholinguistics were George Miller's studies back in the early 60s, based on the idea that if you counted the number of transformations to produce a sentence, you'd get a measure of the perceptual difficulty in recognizing it. That worked for a while, but then it stopped working. And a large part of the reason it stopped working is that linguistic theory had changed. Turned out, and of course, therefore it was giving the wrong results. Turned out that what were thought to be transformations aren't. So you get a different measure. Experimental studies have to keep up with changes in theory. If they keep to earlier theories, they're going to fail, or else they'll be dealing with superficial phenomena. So that's a general principle. And that's why a lot of the psycholinguistic work is just not dealing with the way language is now understood to be. You don't get problems like that in physics. Experimental physics keeps up always with the latest developments. Doesn't study something with an earlier position. Experimental physics and theoretical physics are a single discipline. Unfortunately, that hasn't been true in linguistics. Psycholinguistics and theoretical linguistics have, to some extent, been along different paths, which is a gap. And of course, it leads to the conclusion that you don't get things tested properly. The same is true of neurolinguistics. There are real results, important ones, which keep up to current understanding. The example that I mentioned, for example, is a case, the study of the brain effects of using things like linear order. That's Andrea Moro's paradigm. Many of you know him. But that gap is real and has to be overcome by moving in the direction of the hard sciences, in which the experimental work is always about the current state of understanding.
Thanks a lot, and I hope this answers the question. The next question is by Richard Zimmerman. It's one below in the chat, the one that starts with consider again.
Yeah.
Shall I read it? Consider again example 1 prime. Carefully, the mechanic who fixed the car repaired his tool. What exactly is it in UG that precludes extraction of an adjunct, carefully, out of an adjunct who fixed the car? Reference to merge alone will not do, since a bare version of external merge would allow it.
External merge allows, in fact requires, that carefully be in carefully mechanic fixed the car, repaired his tools, that carefully is externally merged. No problem with that. The issue is the construal. How do you interpret it? Fact is, you don't interpret it as if it were in who fixed the car, okay? That means that the rules of interpretation keep to structure dependence, okay? Not just the rules of moving, but also the rules of interpretation, of construal. Something that's impossible to learn, totally impossible, no data for it, but it shows how powerful the principle of structure dependence is. Even in interpretation, when there's no available data at all, you still adhere to structure dependence. Well, that means strong conclusion. I language simply does not allow linear order. And any theory of language that doesn't have that as a consequence is not a theory of language. It's one of the most fundamental properties of language, both for construction of sentences and for interpretation of them.
Thanks again, and I hope this answers the question. Then the next question is by Ajay Rawat, if I pronounce correctly. Is there a language gene for Homo sapiens? It's again one below in the chat.
Is there a language gene for Homo sapiens?
Yes.
That's not the way genetic works. There's no gene for the visual system. There's no gene for having blue eyes. I mean, every trait that's known, even the simplest ones, are some complex mixture of genetic information, mostly not even known. These are very complex issues. Nobody really knows how the genome, the actual genetic structure, how that yields any specific trait. That's a very complex problem. There's little bits of insight into it, but you're not going to find a language gene, that's for sure. In fact, you don't even know where to look. What is language? Is language just I language? Is language I language including externalization? What is there in I language we call I language mistakenly? Some things that we think are in I language, we're surely going to learn don't belong there. That's the way science proceeds. What you're studying changes as you proceed. It's not the same as what you thought it was at first. You find interfering variables that don't belong. You have to abstract away from them. That's the way all of science works. And this is no exception.
Thanks a lot. And then we'll directly go on to the next question, which is from the live stream. Maybe it's an unrelated question, but I would like to ask Professor Chomsky if there are any parallels that can be drawn between the inherent grammar of language and the inherent grammar of morality.
That's a very interesting question. It has been studied in recent years. if you want to look into it, the major work on the topic is by John Mikhail, M-I-K-H-A-I-L. He's now a professor of law at Georgetown. He was actually, I was one of the supervisors of his dissertation on this topic. I could describe it if you want, but he gave a critical analysis of the work of John Rawls, fundamental work in modern political theory. He pointed out correctly that John Rawls was an old friend of mine. When he was working on his theory of justice, he originally used a linguistic model. He modeled it on the linguistic theory of the day. This is the 1960s. There was so much criticism of this from philosophers that he abandoned it and followed other lines of research. John Mikhail resurrected his early ideas, showed that they were correct, that the criticism was wrong, and expanded them, and developed a kind of a generative model of moral theory. He also carried out experiments, began to carry out experiments with some psycholinguists who tested whether individuals followed the moral judgments predicted. Pretty reasonable success. That work was picked up by Mark Hauser, cognitive biologist and psychologist. He's done extensive work now on several books, if you want to look, on comparative moral systems, very different societies, see if the basic judgments follow the same principles. Also on very young children before much acculturation to see what they do. And there's also further work by Ian Roberts, another linguist, others. Jeffrey Wadable is another. So there is a lot of work on this. And it could be that they come from more or less the same system, worked out in different ways. That's a possibility. But it is a very interesting current topic of research, and one, incidentally, in which psycholinguists and linguists and philosophers are working in close and intimate connection.
Thanks again. And then the next question is by Eric Zeman. It's again in the chat. The arguments for the unavailability of linear order are definitely well taken, but if they're on the right track, how should we understand the obligatoriness in many idealects of what looks like closest conjunct agreement in two below, and then one is a dog and cat, and a dog and two cats are in the room and not is in the room. Two, there is a dog and two cats in the room, and not there are a dog and two cats in the room.
That is usage. It's a small percentage of usage. And there's only one possible way of interpreting it, as grammaticalized speech errors. Because if you look at those examples, they all have the wrong meaning. A dog and two cats are in the room means a dog are in the room and two cats are in the room. Well, it doesn't mean that. So we therefore know that it's a speech error. There are many examples of speech errors that involve adjacency. And occasionally they're grammaticalized, they become normal, but they are errors, as we can see. So these are cases where performance deviates from the actual knowledge possessed. So the actual knowledge possessed is that a dog are in the room is an ungrammatical sentence. And that's what's yielded by these speech errors. This is one of the kind of cases where I was talking about. You just look at phenomena, you get all kinds of confusion. That's why since the 17th century, it's been well understood in the sciences. You can't just look at phenomena. I mean, take the case of a heavy ball and a small ball. If you drop in a light ball, you drop them, the heavy ball will fall faster. So Galileo is refuted, except he isn't refuted because it was understood that you don't look at the phenomena. You design experiments, in his case, thought experiments, which pick out what's important and puts aside the phenomena. That's one of the innumerable reasons why usage-based approaches aren't going to get you anywhere. They don't understand the elementary lesson of the 17th century. I mean, take another example of Galileo's. Suppose you have a sailboat moving forward and you have a ball on the top of the mast and the ball drops to the bottom of to the deck of the sailboat. Well, Galileo demonstrated by thought experiments that it's going to fall to the base of the mast. Suppose he had made the mistake of doing real experiments, would have falsified it. In fact, it would have fallen all over the place. Okay, wrong. Well, the lesson of the 17th century is you don't do that. The phenomena of the world are just too complex, too chaotic to study. So what you do is study a refinement of them. That's what every single experiment is. Every single experiment is an abstraction. It throws out a lot of data and says, I'm going to study this. If it's a good experiment, it made the right choice. But this is a good example. Here's an example of when you look at the phenomena, you think there's a violation. But when you think it through, it can't be a violation because it yields the wrong meanings. So therefore, it's a speech error, a natural, another property is coming in ordinary speech. We try to work things out somehow, even if it violates rules. There's plenty of examples like that. But you have to pick, it's kind of like if you're a field worker and somebody coughs in the middle of an utterance, you don't include the cough, okay? This generalizes very far. Field methods courses teach you how to try to find the things that matter, not other stuff that might be going on.
Thanks a lot. And I also hope and guess that this explains. The next question is from Alexander Hammer. We have still 3 questions in the chat. I think that should be feasible time-wise. The first question is, how can evolvability account for things more complex than merge, like argument structure, theta theory, etc.?
I just can't get this damn thing to work.
I can put it again in the chat. It's now at the bottom.
Oh, I'm going the wrong way.
Evolvability. It's the one all at the bottom.
One down?
All the way down.
One all the way down. Okay. How can evolvability account for things more complex than merge, like argument structure and theta theory? Can't. That's what I said is a total mystery. We haven't the slightest idea how human concepts emerged. We know that they emerged very recently. You don't have anything remotely like them in any other organism. There's no evidence of symbolic activity of any significant kind before Homo sapiens emerged 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. In fact, the first serious rich signs of symbolic activity are the Blombos cave. It's about 80,000 years ago. The archaeological record is pretty thin, but the general point is that after Homo sapiens, you start getting very rich symbolic activity, also complex social structures, complex evidence of complex burial procedures and so on. Well, it's generally assumed by paleoanthropologists quite reasonably that presupposes language. So the facts seem to be this. Language emerged pretty much along with Homo sapiens before humans began to separate about 150,000 years ago. So in that tiny window of time between emergence of humans, I mean, these sound like big numbers, but in evolution, they're nothing, like an eye blink. So in this tiny eye blink, language emerged along with complex concepts and complex social activity, symbolic activity, and so on. Well, we're narrowing the mystery, but there's a lot that remains mysterious. And this is one example.
Okay, thanks a lot. We still have like 4 or 5 questions, but I don't think time permits us to do them all. I will just go down the road. So it's now the one at the bottom. I hope mine is not too trivial a question, but Professor Chomsky denied, if I understood correctly, that human language could derive from other animals' form of communication. And what about the tool making and the growing of its complexity structure, which somehow precede a complex human language? Which kind, if any, bridge or connection can be made? And then thank you again for the great talk.
Can't get it. This one?
The lowest one. I hope mine is not too...
I don't know why, but it won't go down below this. Stops. Can somebody else read it? I'm having a little trouble with your voice. I might get it better with a different voice.
Maybe Gurmeet, could you read it out loud?
Yeah, sure. I hope mine is not too trivial, but Professor Chomsky denied, if I understood correctly.
I see.
Yeah.
I see this one. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That human language could derive from other forms of animal communication. What about the tool making and growing of its complexity structure, which precede a complex human language? Could any connection be made? Well, there's a lot of work suggesting connections, but it's what evolutionary biologists dismiss as just so stories, fanciful tales that you can always invent. You can always invent a fanciful tale about evolution. You know, people, a lot of what's called evolutionary psychology is invention of possible fanciful tales. So you have ears because you have to wear a face mask. Okay, maybe, or maybe not. You have fingers because they're good for typing. These are all over the place. If you try to draw an actual connection between tool making and language, there's none, nothing. I mean, you know, they have complex actions or something like that. But the most elementary properties of language, like the one I mentioned and talked about, structure dependence or displacement, reconstruction, or any other property, there's nothing there in tool making except vague analogies.
Okay, thanks again. And then I think we now go to the final question because of reasons of time. That's the one by Gert Webelhoed. Maybe Gurmeet, you can also read out this one.
Yeah. So it says, "Hi Noam, thanks for a nice and informative talk." Oops, it just went away.
It's at the bottom of the chat now.
Is there another one?
It's the final one.
Down?
Down.
So it says, "Hi Noam, thanks for a nice and informative talk. I have a question about structure
dependence?
Yes, that one, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. One of the reasons why the kind of work that Ambridge does is totally useless. Yes, if you just look at the array of phenomena, you'll find all kinds of things. That's why no scientist since the 17th century has ever done that. What you do is look at carefully shaped and controlled experiments, kid will produce, people will produce all sorts of things. You take I'm sure if you've ever given a talk, informal talk, and looked at the transcript, half the stuff there doesn't make any sense. Okay, that's why people don't look at texts when they're trying to develop a theory, and why physicists, for example, don't look at leaves blowing in the wind when they're trying to find the laws of motion, and why back in the 17th century, Galileo didn't experiment with balls dropping from the mast of a sailboat, because yes, he would have found results just like this. Well, okay, linguistics and cognitive science have to learn to enter this world of science. The world of science that developed in the 17th century has been understood more and more in the hard sciences, still hasn't made it much into the so-called soft sciences. And this is an example.
Okay, thanks again for this answer. And it's now 10 o'clock, so we'll have to call it a day. Noam Chomsky, thank you very much again for this wonderful talk and your willingness to provide this lecture. Greatly appreciated. It was very nice. So thanks a lot. Thanks also to the sign language interpreters. It's probably not an easy job, but you did a great job as well. Thanks a lot. And then finally, thanks to everybody else who facilitated this event. And let me wish you a nice evening or a nice day. Thanks very much. And a special thanks to Noam Chomsky.
Thank you.
Thank you.